John Donvan is a 3-time Emmy Award-winning correspondent for ABC News and the host moderator of the Intelligence Squared U.S. debates heard on public radio. In addition to anchoring ABC's Nightline, he has also served as chief White House correspondent and held multi-year postings in London, Moscow, Jerusalem, and Amman, Jordan. He has also won the Overseas Press Club Award. Karen Zucker, a Peabody Award-winning television news journalist, is a 25-year veteran of ABC News and producer and co-writer of the PBS series Autism Now. Their host and interviewer for today, Russ Bonanno, is a longtime partner of the Illinois State Library for the Targeting Autism Project. He will be sure to leave time for your questions today. Please join me in welcoming our guests, all three of our wonderful speakers for today.
Thank you, and good morning, John and Karen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We appreciate you taking the time to be here this morning and talk with us about your wonderful book. I had the opportunity to read it a while ago and really enjoyed it. And what I'd like to start out with is both of you, as everyone heard from your introductions, spent a lot of time in news reporting and investigations. Could you tell us a little bit more about your backgrounds and what really gave you an interest in this topic?
Well, John and I were both working at ABC News. John's a correspondent and I'm a producer, as we all just heard. And in 1996, my first child was born with autism. And actually, it was John's idea that we start to do some reporting on it. We were going to do something on my son and then decided instead to start a series. And at ABC News, there was nothing on the air. It's hard to believe, but in 2001, we did not really cover autism at all. And we were the first people to get a half-hour broadcast on ABC News that then turned into a series called Echoes of Autism. And then we covered everything from adults with autism to siblings with autism, girls with autism, stories that weren't told before. We never told this sensational story. We really wanted to educate people about autism. And about halfway through that, we thought we need to do something more enduring and started working on the book in 2007.
I think the reason we decided to look at the past partly has to do with my connection with autism, which is less direct than Karen's. My wife has a brother who is autistic and quite impaired by his autism. He can barely speak, and he's not somebody who can function independently. And my wife grew up in Israel. That's where her brother still lives. And her mother, their mother, actually became, in the 1970s, Israel's first and leading autism activist with a group of other parents. And while I was getting to know this family, this new family that I had married into, my mother-in-law talked with me about how much more difficult things had been 40 years ago, how the world had changed dramatically. And I didn't know what she was talking about, so she began telling me stories about how things used to be. And Karen and I became interested in those stories and in rediscovering them. And to write a book that looks at the past and the progress that has been made as an inspiration for two things: for readers who are on the spectrum or who have family members on the spectrum, to be inspired by the success and the progress made by the past, to continue working on the parts of the job, and there are many of them that remain unfinished. And our other goal was to write a book that would really travel outside the autism community. Obviously, since we're telling the story of people with autism and their families, they're a natural readership for our book, but we really wanted to write a book that group would read and say to their friends and neighbors and relatives who maybe didn't know that much about autism, take a look at this book, it's an amazing story. And through that, to get a much wider audience outside the autism community to care, to relate, and to want to have the backs of people with autism.
How many people out there have a family or an extended family with autism? Wow.
And how many people are on the spectrum themselves? And how many people have no connection, direct connection in that sense? Well, we're delighted you're here, and that's because that's what we want to do, is we want to be reaching this larger audience. And we are truly honored to be, I have to say put it this way, we're truly honored to be the guests of librarians. And here's why.
Really?
We were both first-time book writers. Russ, we really didn't know how to do this. We did not know how to write a book. Writing a TV story is a piece of cake compared to writing a book, it turns out. And I spent a lot of time at the National Library of Medicine in Bethesda, Maryland. Karen spent a lot of time traveling around to smaller libraries. And I think we both kind of grew up with a little bit of the fear of the librarian as the husher in the space and the disciplinarian. So I remember approaching at the National Library of Medicine. The first couple of times I approached the librarian, I really needed help, but I really don't want to bother you. And the reaction was the opposite of bothering. We had so much critical support from librarians throughout the process, to the degree that I just borrowed this from Patty. I'm going to give this back to you. But we mentioned this in our acknowledgments, where we meant to thank our families and our colleagues. But we had to put in this section where we gave thanks to the librarians at the National Library of Medicine, to the librarians at the American Psychiatric Association, at the New York Academy of Medicine, at the University of Guelph in Canada, the Autism Society of America, Bowie State University, Brooklyn College Archives, Special Collections, Columbia University, Georgetown University, Howard University, Pennsylvania State, the Martin Luther King Public Library of Washington, the Medical Archives of the Johns Hopkins Medical Institutions, the New York Public Library, the Rockefeller Archive, the Teaneck and Tenafly, New Jersey Public Libraries, the University of Chicago, and the University of District of Columbia Public Libraries. And we put in this sentence, and I'm not pandering, but it's a perfect moment to pander, because we never knew this moment was going to come. We just wanted our readers to know this about you and your profession. We discovered repeatedly that professional librarians love the hunt and have a magic touch for finding gold. We acknowledge their spirit and their intrepidness of these, our fellow searchers. So thank you to all of you in your profession for doing that.
Well, I know I, for one, would never have guessed this was your first foray into authoring a book. To have your first attempt to be so successul.
It only took 7 years.
Well, it hit the New York Times bestseller list much more quickly than that. Part of what you did in your book was you really told a lot of personal stories. You pointed out that autism, while a new diagnosis, is not in and of itself new. And for me, one of the touching points by that was your story about Don Triplett. How did you meet him, and what can you tell us about how he relates to what we're dealing with?
You want to tell the childhood?
We usually divide up the story because we had different parts of it, and part of the interesting part of the story is our connection to Donald that developed. So Donald appears in the first article that really introduced autism to the world as a clinical description, dating to 1943. And Donald was reported in this literature by his first name to be Case 1 in a list of 11 children. So that makes him essentially the first child ever diagnosed with autism in the medical literature. His last name was not given, just the first letter of his last name, T. So it's Case 1, Donald T. And we decided to start our story with autism with the story of the first case and to find out as much about him as we could. And what we learned about Donald, because there were enough clues left in the literature, we were able to find out and figure out what town he was from, and it was a little town in Mississippi called Forest. And we learned through further research, and Karen is a superb investigative reporter, and with the help of librarians, she found correspondence that had never been discovered before in the archives of the Johns Hopkins Medical Center between Donald's mother and a child psychiatrist in Baltimore named Leo Connor. And it told a very, very interesting story. That plus Connor's own accounts in the medical literature of Donald. And the story was this: that Donald was born in 1933 to two rather prominent and well-off parents in a small town in Mississippi called Forest. And they noticed by the time he was about 1 or 1.5 years old that he was not turning out in his social relatedness like they had expected him to. His use of language was quite unusual and to them mysterious. He had echolalia, which, if you don't know, is the tendency not to initiate language, but to repeat language that you've heard already. So he would walk around the house repeating phrases that he had heard his parents use, like he would endlessly recite the word trumpet vine and chrysanthemum. Obviously, he had heard something in the garden. And he would walk around saying, you could put a little comma there, you could put a little comma there. And that was the kind of nature of his language. He also showed very, very little social connection to his parents. He never cried for his mother, ever. He didn't run to his father when his father came home from work. Sorry, I just realized that I heard a little beep that tells me my phone is on, and I want to not be the one who has the phone go off in the middle of the thing. He didn't have any interest in children, and he had a very, very rigid need for things to be the same. So if he walked into the room and the furniture had moved, he would throw a tantrum. Or if he went on a walk with his mother to town, he needed the next time they walked to follow exactly the same path, put his feet in exactly the same place. If he couldn't do that, he would have a tantrum. And they didn't know what to make of him. They just knew that he seemed to be, as they put it, in his own world, seeing things that nobody else saw, relating to those things. And they went to a number of doctors and specialists, psychiatrists. This family was surprisingly well off for 1930s small town Mississippi. The dad was a graduate of Yale Law School, and the mother was also a college graduate and had been a school teacher, and her family owned the one bank in town. So they had education and they had means probably far beyond most people in the community. So they got up to the Mayo Clinic and a lot of other places. But they were advised, and I want to let Karen pick up the story, they were advised when Donald was not yet 3 years old that the thing they needed to do was to put Donald away in an institution.
And that's what happened in that period. And it happened for decades and decades. Parents, when their children were diagnosed, it wasn't even called autism at the time, but anything with a developmental disability, were put away, and they were put away for a lifetime. And it wasn't until parents of the next couple of generations down that began to fight the laws to change them so that they would close down institutions. And part of the problem was that there was nowhere for them to go. And then those same parents and those same advocates fought for school for these kids. Do we want to continue on with Donald or go into?
Yeah, because Donald ended up spending.
So when he was about 3 years old, his parents did what all parents were told to do, which they put their son in an institution. And he was there for about a year when our guess is Mary decided she gave up too quickly. And they went and they took him home, and they decided they were going to figure this out. And they found the most important child psychiatrist in the country, Dr. Leo Kanner, and brought Donald there.
Yeah, and so Donald family took a 2-day train ride from Forest, Mississippi up to Baltimore in October of 1938. And Donald spent 10 days being observed by Kanner. And then he went back home. And then when he went back home, this correspondence started that Karen discovered between Mary Triplett, Donald's mother, and Leo Kanner that went on for years and actually decades. And the first 2 or 3 years of this correspondence, it became clear that Donald had come back to Baltimore a few more times. So there had been follow-up visits. But by 1942, it was clear that Mary was getting very frustrated by the fact that Kanner wasn't able to tell her what it was that her son had, what it was about her son that made him different. She actually wrote to him, that she was in despair over my, quote, hopelessly insane son. And she said to Kanner, basically, why are you not telling me? Are you trying to protect me from something? If he's insane, just tell me, essentially is what she was saying. That's not a verbatim quote. And Connor wrote back saying, I apologize. I realize that I haven't told you what your son has. And the problem is I don't know what he has because it doesn't fit anything that's in any of the textbooks. Again, I want to be clear that I'm paraphrasing. But he wasn't insane. He didn't have a mental illness. He didn't have schizophrenia or something like that, although that had been considered. He wasn't intellectually disabled. And the reason we can say that is Donald had some astounding intellectual talents, even as a 2.5-year-old. For all of that ability for him to want things to be the same, he had to have a memory for how things had been before they changed. He had an astounding memory for how things had been. His father once put a bunch of beads on a string, and then Donald took one look at it and went over to another string, and without looking back over his shoulder, reproduced the exact order that his dad had done. He had that kind of memory. And one Christmas, when he was just about 2 years old, his mother sat down and sang some Christmas carols at the piano, and Donald, who again didn't speak in the typical way, but could repeat what was heard, started walking around the house singing the same Christmas carols, having only heard them one time. He also had a really, really amazing ability to calculate numbers. He was fascinated by numbers, fascinated by calendars. He could tell you, if you told him what your birth date was, he could instantly tell you what day of the week it had been. And so Connor knew this boy was not intellectually disabled. He wasn't sure what it was. But he finally said to Mary Triplett in a letter in 1942, I've been thinking it over, and I think I'm going to have to produce something, report something that's new. And he said, I found 10 other children, mostly boys, but some girls also. And I'm going to write an article about them, and I'm going to call the article Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact. By affective contact, he meant the emotional connection between the children and the world around them. But it was his first public use of the word autistic in his sense. And the article appeared in 1943 with Donald T. as case 1. And that's how we were able to piece together the majority of Donald's past. The other thing, though, is we had another source of information about Donald's past, and that's Donald himself, because somebody here managed to track down Donald, who is today 82 years old and has become our friend. But I want to let Karen tell the story of how we found him.
Well, we knew that his last name began with a T, because it was Donald T. And we knew he was from Forest, Mississippi, and there was about 3,500 people at the time in Forest, Mississippi. So I did what any journalist would do in 2007. I took out the phone book and started looking up all the T's and calling on the phone everyone in Forest. And it didn't take that long. It was only about a dozen names into it where I got an answering machine. And the sound came on, and all of a sudden I heard someone say, hello, happy spring, and have a wonderful fall and a terrific December, and happy 2007. And I have a child with autism. I knew, we got it. I called John, I'm like, Donald, we have Donald Triplett. And then the next step was, well, now what do we do that we found him? We're not going to just walk in and knock on his door. That's not the kind of journalists that we are. And so we wanted to get a proper introduction to him, and so we started to track down people who knew him in the community. John spoke to a fellow journalist, and we spoke to his brother. And what was most interesting, what we learned immediately about Forest, Mississippi, that was incredibly unique, unfortunately, is that this community totally embraced this child from when he was a little boy. And when we said we wanted to meet him, the first thing we were told, you Yankees, you can come down here, but if you mess with Donald, we will track you down and we will get you. And they were really serious. And they were serious because they had made Donald one of them. And his entire life, Donald was, almost like a hero in the community. He was different, he was unique, but he was the community. We always say, John and I always say, if we could bottle, what they had in Forest and put it all over the world, autism would not be so hard for everybody else.
That article that Dr. Connor wrote in 1943, I mentioned that he talked about 10 other children. Most of those children did stay in institutions for most of their lives, and Connor followed up on them 30 years later, and most of them just wilted there. Whereas Donald grew and flourished and reached his potential in this safe, welcoming, embracing, supportive environment of this small town, such that today, at the age of 82, here are some real true facts about Donald. Number one, he lives on his own in the house that he grew up in, and he's healthy. He drives a car. He's got a thing for Cadillacs, and so he always drives a Cadillac, and then he drives it into the ground, gets a new one about every 10 years. He plays golf every day. He plays golf alone, is how he prefers to play it, and he's a bit obsessive about the game, but then anybody who plays golf is a bit obsessive about golf. And most remarkably, he travels the world on his own. A few months ago, I live in Washington, but Karen lives in New Jersey, just outside of New York City. He contacted Karen. By the way, he learned to text about 3 years ago. He texted Karen and said, I'm going to be in town to see some Broadway shows. I would love to get together. And so
He actually doesn't speak that way, but on text, you would not know that he has autism, which is really extraordinary.
And so the things we learned by actually being able to talk with him and go to his community, once people in Forest began to trust us we really reassured them that we were not out to hurt Donald, that we wanted to use his story and the community's story to sort of celebrate a way to accept a person, and it was wonderful that it was the first person ever diagnosed who had this outcome. We just learned that this community accepted him for a few reasons. One is probably because their parents had some clout in town. You didn't want to mess with the Triplett family. They owned the bank. If you ever wanted to get a mortgage, you didn't want to mess with the Triplett family. But that power meant something. That meant that communicated to a safer environment for Donald. Also, Donald was employed most of his life in the family bank. And that meant, again, a safe environment. But very importantly, it was an environment where he could make mistakes and not get fired. He made some pretty classic, let's say, social mistakes working at the bank. He was working for many years as a teller, and he had a habit for a time because he loves numbers. We're going to have to tell a number story in a minute. Actually, let's stop and tell the number story, and then we'll come back to the banking story. Donald had a thing for numbers, and he liked doing calculations. He liked keeping track of numbers. He knew the license plate of every car number in town. He would walk around, park cars, and memorize them. But there's a really famous story that has a lot to do with how people regarded Donald.
Donald was legendary.
This is a legend. This is a legend in the towns that surround Forest even. We would meet people, what are you doing in Mississippi? We're doing a story about Don Triplett. Oh, do you know this guy's a genius?
Story about Donald.
Did you hear the story about the bricks? And we would say, what's the story about the bricks? And the story is that sometime around 1951, when Donald was in high school, he went to a big red brick high school, huge building. And he was standing outside the building when some boys approached him and they said, hey, Don, if you're so smart, why don't you tell us how many bricks are in the school building over there, on this big side of the school building? And Donald looked over his shoulder and glanced at it for like a second, and then he turned back to them and he tossed out the number. And these boys were amazed. And they ran off and told all of their friends. And when we get there, 55 years later, everybody's still telling us the story of, Donald counted all of the bricks in this school building. The guy's a genius.
We asked him, how did you figure it out? And he said, I didn't. I made it up. And we were stunned. And we said, why? And he said, I wanted the boys to like me. So when we think that, our guys and our girls don't get it, they do get it. They just don't talk about it that much.
So Donald gave everybody he ever liked in town or connected with a number. He would walk up to you.
I was 549.
I'm 550. But we can't discern an order to it, and he can't explain it, but we met people.
I think it's who he likes better is lower.
Yeah.
Sorry.
There was a woman we met now who's in her 80s.
But he definitely likes girls.
He likes girls, yeah. There's a woman we met named Janelle Brown, who's now probably about 83, 84 years old. And she said, well, Donald gave me a number back in 1952. I know what it is. It was 1044, I think, something like that. And all over town, we met people who were now senior citizens who could all remember being given a number by Donald at some point in their lives. And we were writing all of these things down. And we went back to Donald and said, can you tell us Janelle Brown's number? Boom, he had it. He had every number. He still remembered that he has this cataloging system. So the story I wanted to tell about the bank and making mistakes is that of course, he had access to all the files. He has this photographic memory, apparently, for numbers. So he would greet customers walking into the bank by their account numbers and sometimes by the balances in their accounts. And so if he wasn't the boss's son, he would be out the door. The fact is that somebody took the time to work with him and to maybe transfer him to a job that would fit him better in the bank. But again, it's a thing about Forrest and the unique conditions he had of having this prominent family allowed him to not just be fired from his first job, but to stay in it and flourish in it. And the story of Donald, as Karen said, is one we wish we could bottle and put elsewhere.
Now, once Donald's condition received a name by Dr. Connor, autism or infantile autism, the next thing that happens with almost any disorder or disease is to come up with the cause. And there have been all sorts of things suggested. And you write about one of the first suggestions of the cause of autism, which is the theory of the refrigerator mother. Could you tell us about that and how it came about, what impact it's had on parents?
Well, it was a horrible time for parents. First, you have a child who's diagnosed with autism, and then you're doing everything you can to help them. And there's very little known about it. And the next thing you learn is, well, it's your fault because you were cold and unloving, because that was the theory of the time. And I spoke to mothers for the story when we were researching the book, a number of different mothers who would tell their stories that they hadn't talked about, in decades and decades, and remembered how it felt. And part of them was hopeful that if I caused my son's autism, my child's autism, I could maybe fix it. And they would be sent, instead of teaching our children, instead of trying to figure out a true cause, it was just blamed on the parents, and specifically the mother. And one of the mothers, Rita Tepper, told me a story about when she went to take her son to the local hospital.
What year was that? Like 1964?
Yeah,
64,
yeah. And instead of treating her son, they were treating her. And they were trying to figure out, what's wrong with you? And she'd been going there for weeks, and one day she was sitting there and a light bulb went off, and she thought, oh, I figured it out. When my son first came home, he was yellow because he had jaundice. And he had this blonde hair that was sticking up like a chicken. And she thought, oh, my kid looks like a chicken. And I thought my baby looked like a chicken, then that must have been what caused his autism. And there was nowhere out there, no one, all the experts, all the psychiatrists, all the psychologists were in agreement. That's what was the cause of autism. And Dr. Lee O'Connor really started that, not in his very first paper, but somewhere down the line, and then it ran like wildfire.
And the consequence of that, in this period, which we call in the book the refrigerator mother era, it really took off around 1948 when Connor gave an interview to Time magazine. And at that time, autism was seen as extremely rare and extremely exotic, and as far as we can tell, this Time magazine article in 1948 was the first time the condition was ever mentioned in the popular press. In that very same article, he said, what seems to happen is these children are born to these cold, unemotional parents and are put, the phrase he used, that they were put into into a freezer that never defrosts. And that was in 1948, and it wasn't really until about 25 years later that the theory finally kind of was fully discredited. So for that 25-year period, as Russ is saying, that was the theory. You're saying, what caused autism? Mothers cause autism. Well, because the answer was there, nobody was looking for any other causes. There was no research whatsoever being done on the nature of autism, not even its causes, but even the nature of it. The children would be born, they would be diagnosed, they would be put in an institution, the mother would be put into psychoanalysis if she had the money to try to have that light bulb moment. Where was it that I did this to my child? Oh, he's a chicken, or whatever it was. So much time was wasted, so much pain was caused. But what turned that around, what broke that stranglehold of this concept was an autism parent, several autism parents, who rejected the notion, who just said it didn't make sense. One of the heroes of our book is a woman named Ruth Sullivan, and Ruth Sullivan is still alive. And she had 7 children, and one of them had autism. She lived in upstate New York. And she knew what the book said, because any time any mother went to the library to find anything out about autism, they would find books that told them that they caused autism. And so she knew what the book said, and she just said, it doesn't make sense. I've got 7 children. One has autism, the other 7 don't. If I was causing autism, I would cause it in all of them. And she began starting an organization, became the first autism organization in the United States, of which now there are now scores and scores and scores, but there used to be only one for many, many years. It was called the National Association for Autistic Children. Its descendant organization is now the Autism Society of America. And she connected with another parent on the West Coast in San Diego, a father named Bernard Rimland. Bernard Rimland happened to be a psychologist. He had a son diagnosed with autism. He read the books that said that his wife did this. He looked at his wife and said, my wife did not do this. My wife is a fantastic, loving, warm person. She's not cold. She did not do this. And he set out over a 5-year period, starting around 1959, to collect everything that had ever been written about autism, to look at the whole body of literature. And he succeeded in doing that. And he turned it into a book, which we can't call a bestseller because nobody really knew about the book at the time. But it was the book that the professional world realized that he had made the case that mothers don't cause autism. So he published that book in 1964. As I've said, it was another 10 years or so before the idea really fully died out in this country. Although if you go to France today, many autism parents in France today are still told that it's the mother's fault, and they're still told you have to go into psychoanalysis. But that idea has been dead here for some period of time now, again, because families fought back against it.
And we've seen, and you mentioned in your book, it's difficult for initial theories, once they've been publicized, to change.
Yeah.
Because you talk about the vaccine theory that came out, and that still comes back in the news periodically, that vaccines cause autism. But as you make clear, the evidence is very strong and straightforward. Vaccines do not cause autism.
Yeah, I mean, our feeling is that it was not a ridiculous question at all to ask. There was a perception, starting around the turn of the century, a perception that suddenly there was more autism than there was before. And there are a lot of reasons to challenge that perception, but the perception was there. And people went seeking for correlations. What else was going on? And the idea was struck upon that children are getting more vaccinations than ever before, which is true.
Yes.
And it provided a pathway into the body, into the brain, because it goes into the arm and reaches the brain. So it wasn't at all an absurd question to ask.
It's a
Right, but
very
study
reasonable
after
But it was
study
asked and then it
after
was answered.
study
It was asked and then
after
it
study.
was answered, yeah.
And so we side with the science on this, and it doesn't mean that parents don't have their own experiences, but that's not what the science has told us.
Exactly. Now, interestingly, I mean, the original diagnosis, infantile autism, and we always see ads about children with autism. We focus on children, but the reality, as the Donald Triplett story shows, I mean, autism does not magically disappear when you leave childhood and go into adulthood. What did you find in the context of your work in terms of services for adults and where things are going?
Well, that's the thing, is that we have, as a society, really, really, leaps and bounds in terms of autism. We still have a long way to go, but in terms of children, we're not institutionalizing them, we're educating them. I mean, people who have children today don't really know how bad it was, and which is the idea behind our book, is to show how far we've come. But the problem is that children with autism grow up into adults with autism. And we have very, very little out there. And it's scary for parents because they've worked so hard to get them to adulthood. And then when adulthood comes, where's the next step? We tell a story towards the end of our book that we think really is kind of the essence of what we're trying to get across.
Can I break in? Because I love telling the story. So it's one of my favorite stories in the book. And it's about a true scene that took place on a bus in New Jersey in 2007. where there was a young man with autism who had been undergoing lessons in how to ride the bus by himself, and he was now seated on a front seat, seated by himself, and he was not somebody who could speak. And he began making noises, sounds, and he began rocking very, very sort of vociferously in his seat, and he began flipping his fingers in front of his eyes. And two passengers who sat down behind him were bothered by this, and they began to harass him, and they leaned into him, and they said to him, "Hey man, cut it out, stop that, what's your problem anyway?"
And then this other guy, this other passenger on the bus, jumps up and he looks at these two guys and he says, "What's your problem? He has autism. Why don't you just back off?" And the entire bus got behind this young man and the passenger who stood up for him. And at that moment in time, that place in New Jersey, that bus, became a community of people that watched out for that one young man. And that's what we need to do, all over the country. We can do that. That doesn't cost anything.
And if that young man who was on the verge of manhood was a little boy, that wouldn't have happened. But adults are still not welcomed in the larger community. And that's the thing we want our book to serve on two levels: to inspire people who are inside the community to see how much work was done for kids and how far things have come, even though it's not perfect, because society did not want to see the kids 40 years ago. But that's changed. And to do the same thing for adults. And the second thing is to let people who don't know anything about autism to know that they are passengers on that bus. Whether they know it or not, they're passengers on that bus. They're part of the community. Be the ones who stand up, not the bullies. And that's the message that we hope the book will get across to people who just find it a good read, that they'll stealthily suddenly realize that they have a part in the story too.
Okay, and what I'd like to do now, if it's okay with you, is open it up to questions from the audience.
Sure.
John and Karen have agreed to answer questions. We ask just that these are questions of a general nature. They're not here to provide specific advice on specific situations. We have a microphone approximately in the middle of the room. If you'd come up to that area and ask your question, feel free.
What is your, I don't have this obviously very well formed here, but if you could cure autism, would you?
Say that again?
If a cure were available for autism, do you view, if we could cure it, would you?
Oh, it's a highly, highly controversial topic.
Right.
And
you're the guys to ask, so.
Yeah, well you go ahead.
It's, if you have a child who is, banging their head against a wall and will never lead an independent life and is not getting joy, and there is something that you could give them to cure them, I can't imagine why you wouldn't. I have a son who's somewhere in the middle of the road, who's always going to need support. I'm happy to keep him just the way he is, but I don't know that he's happy to be that way, to not have an independent life. And I think that there are people, on the far end of the spectrum who are self-advocates, and even though they struggle, they wouldn't change anything about themselves because their autism is who they are. And I think cure is a very personal choice. And if we can help people who are suffering, we should help people who are suffering. And we should support people who are here to live the best life they can with the best services society can manage.
A follow-up to that then would be that before coming here, I was reading about oxytocin, intranasal dosages, and some people on the spectrum will have, for a time, improved certain social skills. And so now that I am reading about medical, science kind of going along that fixing some of those difficulties, like I understand it as a treatment, but this seems like the place to ask, and you guys have the depth of knowledge, so I'm interested in your perspective on treating autism, like from a medical standpoint.
Well, right now we don't have a cure. We know that it's genetically based. But we're, that's one thing that they're testing. There's, there were literally hundreds of studies going on because parents created scientific advocacy foundations in the 1900s, in the late 1900s, 1995, where there weren't any before. So now at least we have a scientific field that's looking into it.
Thank you.
The other thing I would say, and the reason I was pointing out that it's a controversial issue is for those who don't know it, there's a strong tension in the autism community that exists between those who see autism as a problem that needs elimination and those who see autism as a form of identity and neurological wiring distinctive that needs support and celebration.
And even a gift, which it is.
And even a gift, which it can be. But we suggest in the book that this tension exists partly because the definition of autism itself has become so broad, and the spectrum has become such a large and almost vaguely defined concept that it includes people whose experiences in life and experiences of the traits that are called autistic traits are so dramatically different that it's not a simple answer, should you cure or should you not cure? It depends on who you are. It depends on how you're succeeding in life. It depends on what you want if you're the person with autism. Temple Grandin is the best known self-advocate. If you don't know her story, she's in her 60s and she emerged in the 1980s writing books about, I'm a person with autism, here's what my life is like, here's what my challenges have been. There's been a great movie made about her on HBO called Temple Grandin. And she says, if I could snap my fingers in a second and not be autistic, I would not do it. I do not want to change who I am. But we know and have encountered many families, and my brother-in-law is one of them, who was biting his arm down to the bone, and who, even at this point in his life, needs 24-hour surveillance and care, because if he walks out the door, he'll walk into traffic, not understanding the dynamics of traffic, and he'll be run over. I don't think that his mother, my mother-in-law, sees that as something to celebrate. So it depends on who you are. And unfortunately in the autism community, people at both extremes always want to speak for everybody across the full extreme. And we think that that's an impulse that we need to address, and for there to be more tolerance of competing points of view, because the spectrum itself is such a large concept.
I think recognizing the uniqueness of each person on the spectrum
Absolutely.
is extremely important.
Absolutely.
It may turn out it's not even one condition. I mean, we went from several to one in the most recent release.
And we talk about that there may be many different autisms, not just one.
Exactly. And I think the genetics are suggesting that.
But the key thing is to recognize and celebrate the humanity of everybody, regardless. Let's celebrate the humanity of my brother-in-law who as a child was biting his arm. Let's give him every opportunity that he has in life. Let's give him all the support, the love, the support. We don't need to discuss whether to cure him or not. Let's discuss whether to support him or not.
So I'm from an academic library, and when I hear about researchers, I'm all like, research. So I'm very happy.
That's how we are about librarians.
A lot of the presentations we've heard at Targeting Autism this for Thursday and Friday have been more geared towards children, which is totally fine. But having done lots of research in libraries and archives and things like that, what are some of the recommendations, thoughts, ideas around how academic libraries can serve our college students with autism? Because we know that a lot of them come into our libraries, quote unquote, as invisible disabilities. So what could we be doing to help them, especially in the research process?
Yeah, boy, I'm going to be totally
Let me ask
honest.
a hard question.
You're outside of our area of expertise. I think it's more your area of expertise. I think the obvious thing is to listen. Is to listen, but you're doing that anyway.
Give them our book.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I meant to say that was the first answer. Give them our book.
But really, I mean, it is a comprehensive history that hasn't been written before in this way. It is through storytelling, but it really is the history from and even before 1943. It goes back into the what was there autism before? We talk about that. It's not a bad starting point. and they don't have to buy it. They could just read it
Right.
from the library.
I'm sorry that we're doing a commercial answer to your question.
But I don't know. We spent 7 years researching it. So what are the things, to pick out? We picked out the things that we thought were you could also send them to our bibliography. They don't even have to read the book.
Thank you.
I mean, but I'm sure there are things you're working on that a lot of people with autism respond to more visual than audio. Think of visuals. Think of the iPad has been a tremendous tool for lots of people who have difficulty perhaps with spoken language, but have a lot to say and a lot to ask. So I'm thinking there are software solutions and things like that as well.
And I would also say, I think John and Karen's book with the story of Donald really shows what the community did to help an adult throughout his lifespan. And I think universities are a community. So for me, the question would be, how does the university help students with autism, and what role does the library play in the university?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. During your research of the different families that had children and adults impacted by autism, how many African Americans or families of color did you interview?
One.
Really? Okay, thank you.
You want some more commentary on that?
That's why I was standing there waiting.
I'll tell you, we actually addressed this issue directly in the book. We went back and we did the history. We did what was happening in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And in that period, it was extremely difficult for a person of color to be diagnosed with autism. And one of the reasons was that the system's initial impulse would basically to say, the child's African American, the child is mentally retarded, boom, that would be the end of the story.
It was just
bigotry
and
the reason that we
force.
don't have that is because we were, to a degree, we're repeating the legacy of that situation. The one exception is a mother named Betty Camp, who, again, elderly now. She's probably 79 or 80 years old. And she was a very, very big activist in North Carolina. And she's a critical player in the founding of a program. You may have heard of this program called TEACH. It's an approach to education that grew out of North Carolina and the University of North Carolina. And there were two parents who saved TEACH from being shut down in 1971. And she was one of them. And another one is named Mary Lou Warren. And her son, whose name is Normie, who's now like 53 years old, is still living at home with her. She has not found an adult solution for her. But I talked with her about the difficulty of getting a diagnosis if you're African American, and it was an interesting thing that she didn't really want to talk about it at great length. I think because it was the past for her. But it's also still the case today.
And we talk about it in our book. We have a whole section on when we talk about prevalence and the rates of autism.
Yeah, I mean, it's another point in the story where we make reference to this trend, but we don't tell it through a story. But what we're doing is what we discuss is this issue of whether there's an epidemic or not. And there are many, many reasons to question whether there's an epidemic. And one of the reasons to question it is that we are so uneven in who we count as having autism or not. And the fact is that autism rates appear to be higher in affluent white communities than in minority communities and in communities of less affluence.
And we know that autism hits everybody.
Yeah,
but that's how it's counted.
But the numbers would suggest that could mislead people to thinking that people of color don't have as high rates of autism. Well, that's nonsense. What the reality is what communities have people looking for autism, what communities have services, what communities have a clinic, what communities have a sufficient number of pediatricians who are educated enough to look for it in all of the children. It's going to be the more affluent communities. So the notion that people of color have lower rates of autism, we completely think is wrong, and it also is still, it's a legacy of a lot of social conditions that this continues to be the fact. So that answers your question to some degree.
I have two questions, both of which are really short. Number one is, what do you think of the differences between females and males who are on the spectrum? And number two, for us librarians who are looking for good places to buy or find information about autism, do you have any good resources that you particularly recommend?
I didn't hear the
Girls.
first one.
With the differences between boys and girls.
Yeah.
You know, that's one of the million-dollar questions in terms of, are there actually more girls than we count, because girls hide it better. And so that is one of the differences. I think that, like we say, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. I think that that's pretty much the same for girls and boys. It's just that it's much. We're starting to see that it might be counted less, and what we're also starting to do is do research on, instead of figuring out what is it about boys that there are more boys with autism and what are their traits, we're starting to look at girls with autism and what is it that protects them from having autism or having more severe
If that's the
qualities.
case, if that's the case. And as far as resources for libraries to sort of learn about autism, I don't think we have a specific recommendation on that. And we've kind of decided on a number of questions when we really don't know what we're talking about to just stop talking. So we don't have it's a great question. It just doesn't happen to be one that we've looked at. But I'm not sure that the answer necessarily would be specific to librarians. I just think that there's a wide range of books that you can read to learn about autism, and autism today is a conversation that is mostly taking place online, and there are many, many, many kinds of sites. You just need to know that every site nowadays almost has a political identity because of the various strains and disputes. But if you, as we do, we read across a broad range of things to learn about the attitudes and the opportunities out there.
But if you do come across first-time parents who are looking for help and research, Autism Speaks really has a lot of toolkits, like the first 100 days, and how to have your child get a haircut, and they do have a very good online practical resource guide that I would have killed to have 18 years ago.
And just to say, we're going to wind down with the last person in line, so we'll take these questions.
Okay.
In researching your book and looking at, my question is around trends that you've noticed in order to move the needle forward, and where do you think moving the needle forward in terms of adult programs and services is going to happen? Does it need to come from a parent community, or like a lightning rod within the community, or does it come from the policy level? Where does it, at what level does it need to kind of bubble up in order to gain a foothold, in order to advance the needle in a real way that
Has
sticks?
to come from all of them, because if you don't have it on a policy level, nothing's going to get done. If you don't have parent advocates coming up with new plans and new models, because those are the ones who do it, because those are the ones that sort of get what the need is. So it's still parents who are sort of designing the future, but they need to work together with people who are making policy, and understand that autism is something that is a service disorder almost. They are people who need support and services. Is that?
Yeah, so I'm hearing it's a collaborative effort that's oftentimes
And it's not
spearheaded by parents.
Right, and it's not right now. It should be. That's what it needs to be.
You were talking about refrigerator moms and things like that, and I think now it's more like mom guilt. You're raising a child. My son was not ever formally diagnosed with Asperger's, but he's 29 now, and he was diagnosed with ADD and depression, and I know that he has Asperger's now. In high school, the pediatrician said, maybe he has Asperger's. And we were at the therapist, and I mentioned it to the therapist, and he said, ADD has a lot of the same things, and he gave me the impression that I needed to stay away from that diagnosis. So I did. But the more educated I've become, and he's become, I mean, both of us know that he has Asperger's, the social, the eye contact, the sucking on his shirt, and he still does that at 29. Just different things that you know, yes, he does have Asperger's, but he never has been formally diagnosed. And I think that when you're raising a child who doesn't behave in the way that society thinks they should, the neighbors think he should, you have all this mother guilt, like what should I have done or what should I be doing? And I think now that I'm doing special needs story time at a library, I feel like I'm assuaging some of that because I'm helping other parents to feel okay and that kind of thing.
I want to let Karen answer the guilt question because we've talked about it and it's come up in other conversations, but the very short thing I'll say about, you know, if your son's sucking on his shirt and that bothers people in a restaurant, we got to get to the world where the people in the restaurant have to learn to roll with it. It's not, you know, so what if he's sucking on his shirt? I mean, there are a lot of those sorts of...
Parents need to get to the point where they can say, you know, that's my kid.
Yeah, and be confident and have most of the people, again, be those people who stand up on the bus. But you've talked a lot about the guilt question.
Well, I think it's innate almost that when there's something wrong with your child that you can't help them, you feel guilty, and it doesn't matter if it's autism, if they're struggling, you know, with a friend at school. You know, it's a parental reaction to helping.
You want to fix
your
that.
child.
That's like your responsibility to make everything okay.
And the refrigerator mom is a perfect example of, you know, well, I wasn't a refrigerator mother, but I still tried to figure out, what did I do?
And I think the important thing is, as a parent, every parent does the best they can do for their child and works to help their child. And whether or not somebody comes up with a diagnosis that seems to be right, what's most important is your child getting what he needs to become the most he can be, the best he can be.
Please join me in thanking all three of these wonderful folks.